Hello, my name is Amy Galpin, and I'm the Chief Curator of the Frost Art Museum at Florida International University. Tonight, I welcome you to a presentation with Rosa Lowinger, followed by a conversation with Rosa and our director, Jordana Pomeroy. We also invite you to put questions in the chat throughout the program. Rosa Lowinger is President and Chief Conservator of RLA Conservation of Art and Architecture, a firm with offices in Miami and Los Angeles, specializing in outdoor sculpture and integrated architectural artworks. A graduate of the Institute of Fine Arts in New York, she is a fellow of the American Institute for Conservation, the Association for Preservation Technology, and the American Academy in Rome, where she studied vandalism during her 2008 to 2009 Rome Prize. Rosa has served as the guest editor for the vandalism issue of the University of Pennsylvania's journal, Change Over Time, and writes regularly for mainstream media about culture, conservation, and historic preservation in Cuba. She co-curated Concrete Paradise, Miami Marine Stadium at the Wilsonian, and Promise Paradise, Cuban Allure, American Seduction at the Coral Gables Museum. She is the author of the nonfiction book, which I can attest to being an incredible read, Tropicana Nights, The Life and Times of the Legendary Cuban Nightclub. Dr. Jordana Pomeroy has been the director of the Frost Art Museum since 2015. An early job working in the arena of public art introduced her to the complexities inherent in the process of choosing art for public places. Dr. Pomeroy's scholarship has focused on the role of 19th century museums as training grounds for British citizens about the nature of good taste. While these intersections raise valuable questions about what we can expect when we build structures and monuments that we impose on communities, and how that differs from the art seen within the walls of a gallery. At the Frost FIU, Jordana launched the university's first public task force to look at the issue of public art, to oversee the preservation and care of art in public places throughout our campuses. She is a friend and a fan of Rosa's, who has partnered with the Frost to raise awareness about the integral role of public art in public life, as well as resources required for its care and conservation. Rosa, like Jordana, I'm a big fan and admirer. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Rosa Lowinger.
Thank you very much. My lighting here is changing a little bit, but my presentation is really going to be on the screen. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And let's see if this works. All right. There we go. Thank you very much for that introduction, Amy and Jordana. And I want to say how pleased I am to be here and how grateful I am to be invited to address this group from the Frost. I'm coming today from Los Angeles, California, and I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement to say that I'm in the unceded land of the Tongva and Chumash peoples, and I want to start by paying my respect to the Tongva and Chumash communities and their elders. For the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking about altering, damaging, and destroying monuments and works of art. I'm going to show how this is a centuries-old practice and why it's a valuable tool in our national current desire to right social wrongs. I'm only going to speak for 20, not 30. I use the word vandalism to refer to this activity, but it's not a word that fits entirely. I've had people take issue with it, saying that it connotes something negative, but as I'll show you, I kind of differ with that point of view. Vandalism is a bit of a malleable word, and let me show you now why I say that. I'd like to begin with a couple of definitions. On the screen, you can see a couple of different types of vandalism. There are two different ways that people intervene into works of art in public space. One is by adding stuff, spray paint, stickers, magic marker, paint. Another is by actually destroying, damaging, breaking, or removing original historic material. They're both different approaches to that, and it's all relevant for the current conversation about what to do with contested heritage, especially monuments that are offensive. Here are some historical examples of the destructive type of intervention. You can see some of these very, very dramatic ways of dealing with heritage, and not all of it had a benign approach, of course, including the destruction of the Mostar Bridge, the spectacular work of Balkan Islamic art that was destroyed by Croatian forces during the 1993 war. Of course, the ritual exploding of the Bamiyan Buddhas in 2003 by the Taliban. These are acts of vandalism that were intended to be ruthlessly brutal against the people who cherished that material. There's also, of course, the toppling of statues of dictators, which we tend to herald and be happy about because it usually connotes a degree of regime change. What I hope to do in this presentation is to show that though there is a lot of discussion about what is right or wrong about addressing contested material, these kinds of interventions have a historical precedent. And this year, the defacement, destruction, and removal that we've seen as vital means of redressing symbols of racism and injustice have a lot of different parallels in different cultures and historical moments. One image I'm very fond of showing always, which really kind of was a game changer for me when I first saw it in Italy during my Rome Prize research on the topic of vandalism, is this mural from the Monastery of St. Benedict in Subiaco, Italy. It was painted, the original mural was painted around 1160, and it's one of many in this remote mountaintop retreat. And of course, it's one of thousands and thousands of murals of the Virgin Mary that are throughout the Italian peninsula. What makes this one noteworthy, of course, is the centuries of incised graffiti on the Virgin's face. These markings go through the paint layer into the ground and the substrate, and they constitute what we would call permanent damage to the mural. However, these markings tell a story that is much deeper than the image itself. It would be unthinkable as a conservator or as a steward of this site to consider the possibility of filling and inpainting and otherwise removing those markings. The vandalism in this case is part of the historical relevance of the work. It's what gives it meaning beyond just being yet another mural of a similar subject matter. Similarly, the same can be said of the graffiti that is well documented on the walls of Pompeii in ancient Italy, and of course in many other ancient historic cities of that nature. The words that you see here, and I translate them so you can see the scatological, prurient, and indecent nature of them, tell us stories about people who were not significant enough to be codified in the historical volumes that were written of the day. A lot of the research that's been done on ancient graffiti, and particularly about Pompeii and Herculaneum, points to the fact that a lot of these words were of slaves, of women, people that did not have any social or political agency. And of course, no one would see any issue with conserving these images. They are well cared for. They are constantly managed as part of the management of the site itself, because they're a significant part of what we know about the population of ancient Pompeii and Herculaneum. Since the advent, however, of the permanent marker and the aerosol paint can in the mid-20th century, we've seen contemporary urban landscapes covered in writing and pictures of different sorts. You see images here from Venice, Los Angeles, Rome, and Belgrade. Are these are these good things or bad things? People have very many different approaches to it. Certainly in modern times, the whole question of street art has been something that we venerate, and I have some further discussion about this to show later on. But what do they mean? Are they simply acts of mischief? Do they promote a greater meaning? This is something that is under a lot of discussion from scholars. I certainly adore the tagging of this mural of this billboard of Spider-Man that you see up on the upper left in Los Angeles. But that is part of what we're trying to consider. What is the meaning of all of this? Is it something that we look to as a positive thing, or is it a scourge on the city, as one might see or say about the walls that are tagged in Venice below? Here then, I want to bring up like a second series of definitions about vandalism. In general, during my research, I was able to sort of think about it in three different ways. It basically divides up into three different types of topics, which of course many other subtopics. The first is iconoclasm and socio-political vandalism, such as the toppling of statues, the writing Black Lives Matter on a statue, the pouring of red paint to signify blood on this sculpture of Christopher Columbus that you see on the screen. Secondly, and a lot of things fall within that. The second topic, which I don't really go into right now because it's its own difficult to codify whole topic, is that works of art and monuments tend to attract acts of insanity. For example, the repeated slashing of Barnett Newman paintings, or the Night Watch in Amsterdam, or the destruction of the Pietà in Rome back in the 1970s. So that's its own thing. But it is interesting to me always that works of art and public monuments are sort of surrogates for violence in this way by people who are not really of clear mind. Then also there's what we call the contemporary street art dialogue with space, which I think we all kind of understand what it is. The column that you see on this screen is along those lines. There's no political or underlying meaning to that. It's just kind of a mischievous approach to public art and space. And of course, some of the tagging that you saw in the previous image is of that nature too. You have a wall and it's worth painting. But across our country these days, there are monuments that we now all understand to be oppressive to our fellow citizens that are being intervened in similar manners. Confederate monuments are uniquely heinous because not only do they venerate a rogue group that broke off from the United States and waged war against our country, what it would normally be called treason, but the primary intent of the installation of these monuments in the 20th century was to continue the humiliation and degradation of freed African Americans with the glorification of the slave past. Does graffiti transform the meaning of these monuments? I believe it does. Is it enough? Well, the current thinking in the field, and I agree wholeheartedly with it, is that it is not appropriate for me, a white art conservator, to be the one who arbitrates that decision. The people who were targeted by such monuments are to be the major voices in what to do with them. But as you can see from these images, vandalism does work toward a common good. It works in the direction of an appropriate response. But again, it's only one of the possible things. Removing them is also a possible thing. And there are many responses to this, which I hope we'll discuss in the discussion portion. And I'm sorry about this crazy lighting that's on me. Hopefully you're looking at the screen. But at the same time, that type of intervention is a bit of a double-edged sword. On the screen, you see on the left, a statue of the beloved African-American tennis star, Arthur Ashe. It was tagged during the summer of 2020 with WLM for White Lives Matter, which is a term that aims to decry the current social justice efforts, even though Ashe himself had not a thing to do with oppressing white people. On the right also is a detail of a sculpture that honors the Korean comfort women, a group of girls forced into sexual slavery by the Imperial Japanese Army during World War II. These comfort women sculptures are located in many places around the world, and they're frequently vandalized by individuals, typically of Japanese descent, who challenge the historical evidence that Japan had sexual slaves. It happens to be an ongoing problem with political repercussions between the nations of Japan and South Korea, and it is played out on these monuments. One person's monument is another person's scourge. The example on the screen is one that the examples on the screen are of particular personal meaning to me, a Cuban immigrant to the United States. On the right, you see a statue, a relief bronze of Che Guevara, taken from Alberto Corda's famous photograph and applied to a mid-century modern building by the Cuban architect Aquiles Capablanca. And also on the bottom, you see one of the many, many dozens of objects and knickknacks and t-shirts and hats that extol the revolutionary fervor of the man known as El Che, who is the darling of many people with whom I otherwise share complete political affinity. But for Cubans, and especially those of us who fled the country's repressive regime, Che Guevara is the ultimate representative of that repressive government. He was responsible for the summary execution squads that were televised in the 1960s. His property nationalization program stripped middle-class families, including mine, of all their possessions. But he's a hero to many other people. One person's hero is another one's dictator. In today's America, I need say little more, but I also want to point out the image on the left, which says, Abajo Batista Asesino, down with Batista Assassin, which is a graffito that currently exists in downtown Havana. It is from the 1950s and continues to be lovingly conserved year after year in a country that allows no political graffiti against its current leadership. So it kind of shows you why some of the different ways in which this plays out in different places. Excising the name of offenders is another way of showing change, as in, for example, this primary school in Santo Domingo, where murals containing images of Rafael Trujillo, who ruled the DR, were left in place, but the face of the dictator was blacked out. Incidentally, this particular image I find a great example of the difference between vandalism and accidental damage. The scratches on the bottom of the mural are from the chairs of school children. It's not vandalism. Acts of removal of this sort, though, can also be worthy, acts of removal are also worthy of ceremony. In Los Angeles, for example, there were numerous formal dismantlings of prominent sculptures of Father Junipero Serra, a Catalonian missionary and Franciscan priest that was beatified and in 98 and canonized in 2015, but was also known for approving the torture and enslavement of indigenous people up and down the coast of California. The decapitation and destruction of his sculptures are now, began to happen as soon as he was canonized, and they continue to be done. But again, this article by Carolina Miranda in the Los Angeles Times that talked about the ritual toppling is meaningful because sometimes how you remove things is as meaningful as whether you remove them. And incidentally, the Father Serra sculptures, along with Christopher Columbus, are some of the most contested materials that are being removed in addition to Confederate monuments. Vandalism is not always political, and it's not always aggressive or destructive, but what it always is intentional. Steve Wynn putting his elbow through a painting is not vandalism. It's an accident, a boneheady accident, but it's an accident. However, the suffragettes slashing Velázquez's Rokeby Venus in an act of political protest is vandalism. The message can be big or small, as you can see on this screen. And when people complain about, the destruction of monuments by Black Lives Matter movements, I like to point out that the suffragettes in the early 20th century did a lot of damage to a lot of monuments, a lot of public property. And right now, I'm sure that no one in this presentation or anyone that we probably know would argue that what they were fighting for was worthy. I want to show a couple of other images that show some of the different approaches to vandalism and what they mean. This is a mural by the Filipino artist Eliseo Silva in downtown Los Angeles. And almost right after it was installed, it began to be tagged by members of the Filipino community. When the city of Los Angeles aimed to conserve it, the conservators were confronted by some of the individuals that were tagging, saying, "What are you doing, removing our homage to our own community?" It was actually seen by the people who did it as a way of responding in a positive light to what was there and adding to it, rather than something that people interpreted as, destructive or offensive. And in this moment in time, when cities and communities are debating what's considered an appropriate response to offensive heritage, and I'm not talking about the glorifications of slavery installed during the Jim Crow era, which are unto themselves a category, but monuments to Columbus, Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and really anybody whose image graces a plinth these days. Probably if you scratch their past, there is offensive material there. But the question is it valuable to consider alternatives that allow us to tell the story differently than simply remove the artwork or the monument? And one of the responses to this that I really love is work done by the artist Joydi Minaya, a Dominican United Statesian artist, as she refers to herself. Her body of work includes the creation of fabrics that depict the images of plants used by indigenous peoples of the Caribbean to fight colonial powers. And she creates these sort of fabrics in a lycra bathing suit-like material and uses them to wrap monuments of Columbus throughout the Caribbean and in Florida as well. Now, I don't know how far I've gone, how long I've gone, how much more time do I have? Should I continue or yes? 2 minutes? All right, let me just give you one more example. Our local favorite building, the Miami Marine Stadium. This is a building whose actual meaning and importance and heritage value was transformed by vandalism. For those of you who don't know the story, this is how the building looked in the 1960s when it was first built, designed by Hilario Candela, a prominent Miami architect who was just a young man at the time. The building was initially built for the purpose of speedboat racing and concerts, but the city and its was not able to monetarily make it work. So they were looking for reasons to get rid of the building for years. They used Hurricane Andrew as the excuse, saying that the building was damaged irrevocably, but it really wasn't. So they weren't able to use FEMA money to knock it down. Instead, they decided to allow it to demolish by what is called demolition by neglect. Just let it sit there and hope it fell apart on its own. They let the fire department spray, test their water cannons on the building with salt water, which is extremely damaging, but the building was really well built and nothing happened. Then the graffiti community discovered it in the late 1990s. And I'm sure you all know the story. They transformed the building into one of the most prominent graffiti sites in the world and started drawing people from throughout the world to tag the building, paint on it. Eventually, as part of the program to conserve the building, a series of murals were done on it to draw attention to it. And what's most interesting to me is that the 85-year-old architect, who is pictured on the bottom right-hand image in his dapper gray suit and beautiful blue tie, said, listen, when we're restoring this building, we should try to save the graffiti, because these artists kept my building alive. They kept it relevant. And if we think about it, the entire younger generation of stakeholders that will use this building in the future knows it primarily as a graffiti site. So it's an interesting issue. We worked a little bit on the plans for conserving the building, and in fact, for its true restoration, the graffiti does need to come off so that we can remove salts and other damage from it. But the question of whether it should be allowed to be done again is one that retains. And finally, One of my favorite uses of creative paint on a monument. This is the monument to the Soviet Army in Sofia, Bulgaria, that venerates an act of political violence against a people. And this monument gets painted in this sort of creative and funny way a lot. So I think anytime we can use paint and humor to change the dialogue, I think it's valuable. But again, as I said, this is not my call. This is a community discussion about what to do with Confederate monuments moving forward. And that is my presentation. Thank you very much. I will now stop my screen share.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I assume our 51 participants can as well. Welcome to the Frost Art Museum After Dark. And Rosa, it's such a pleasure to have you here. I'd seen a longer version of this presentation a while ago, and I thought this is something that I really want to bring to Miami, to our members and our friends to hear about, because it's such a hot button issue right now. And I think the phrase, the impermanence of permanency comes to mind. You know, we talk about vandalism and desecration of the past. I want, you know, and I wonder if you might, I'm going to ask you a few hard-hitting questions, but of course I've already previewed them with you, so you're well aware of what I'm going to ask.
You should have made me look better than that. Felt like I'm so brilliant that I could come up with.
You are brilliant. It's you're good. I'm just wondering first, you know, you opened so many doors for questions, and graffiti still sort of sits in limbo, and it's just struck me as so funny because it's ancient, you know, it's an ancient form of expression. And as you know, like the 70s, the graffiti movement, you know, took off, and then you have it legitimized in like the Los Angeles County Museum of Art and other museums. It's funny that we're still having this. Aren't we post-graffiti nation at this point? And also, I mean, we go to Brazil, you get a lot of, you know, a lot of South American countries, they're really proud of their graffiti. And there's really sort of some fabulous examples. Are we not post-graffiti? I mean, how do we maybe have a new conversation about this?
Well, it's interesting, you know, I was, it's so interesting you asked that, because well, there's graffiti, and there is street art, and then there are commissioned murals like Wynwood Walls. There's nothing graffiti about Wynwood Walls. These are commissioned murals. They happen to be done in the style of street art, but there's nothing spontaneous or, you know, or risky about them. And they're no different than when a public art program commissions a mural. I think maybe the only difference is that sometimes the questions of permanence are less, how should I say, they're less prominent. People like, you know, I think when people are talking about like street art, they kind of are in the middle between commission murals and the work that, say, so many of the artists did at the Marine Stadium, where they just sort of slapped up color as a base and then went to work without any sense that this work was going to be permanent, because the work primarily lives on the internet in images. This is how the artists work. When they were working at the stadium and other such sites like 5 Points and whatnot in New York, the idea is the image to put up the work, and then it lasts as long as it lasts, and the documentation lives on the internet. That's that kind of thing. I'm really sort of, again, I'm not the arbiter of what should be done with monuments, but I do love seeing them standing there covered in reaction, because when you take it away, it's gone. Then the voices are silenced. But I like seeing how we are dealing with it now in this day.
Well, so let's go right to the core issue. We are living in a time, I mean, literally in the last year, dozens of monuments have been taken down that honored the Confederacy. And for those who have joined us and may not be aware, a lot of these were put up during the Jim Crow era. I mean, they were not put up just, you know, at the time of the Civil War or the War of Northern Aggression, depending on where you're from. And I think that, you know, I've read numerous articles that I actually find funny because I figure they're not coming from museum people who talk about what are we going to do? Where are we going to relocate? Why don't we just put all these, you know, men on horses on, you know, in a museum? And I'm thinking, where would you possibly do that? So I'm curious, Rosa, what have you thought about when you've, you know, sort of listened to this debate?
Well, again, white person's opinion, okay? And I'm willing, and I say it knowing that I need to stand back. But my thinking is, you know, the Wolfsonian, for example, an FIU institution, is full of some of the most heinous stuff in the world. Mickey collects this crazy Nazi material, and it's interesting to see it. I find it valuable to see that. So I'm not one that is for melting down the sculptures, unless of course it's done ritually, etc. I think it's good to, and don't forget, we're in the moment right now. We're in the moment when all this is happening. To make a permanent decision for all of these monuments is kind of premature. That said, they cannot be allowed to exist in a way that is denigrating to so many of our fellow citizens. So my point of view, and of course we can't put them all in museum storages, but there, you know, lots of countries have dealt with this. The Soviet Union dealt with it, with monuments that they put into these parks where they toppled them into a park. Now, of course, in Italy being Italy, you know, there's Mussolini monuments all over the place, and it's like, okay, whatever, you know. But I do believe that there's a value to contextualizing.
Well,
If you ask me, if someone were asking me where I would stand, I would love to see I love that monument that is just covered. It's one general or another covered in graffiti. I love seeing these monuments covered in the response of Americans who say no. On the other hand, if you leave them there, there's always the possibility someone will decide later to wipe off the graffiti. So I think there's a lot of right answers. I don't think there are any wrong ones, and there are a lot of right ones.
Okay, I'll take that. I think, you know, I think that it doesn't matter what I think. I believe that, you know, there's got to be sort of a consensus about how we look at the past. And, you know, it's hard as a white museum director for me to say it should be this way or it should be that way. On one hand, preserving history is critical to our nation's future, correct? But on the other hand, the reasons, the context behind the citing of these works, the commission of these works is we look back and we don't agree with those principles anymore, which again still goes to so it's sort of a funny question about the permanence, the impermanence of permanence. There's no, you know, history evolves and changes. So why do we keep making these enormous works, Rosa, that you actually conserve? Maybe it's so it keeps you in business, actually.
Well, you know, yeah, I know. I have my own production factory. No, the thing is that, well, I think here, okay. So for example, in Germany, you're not going to find one monument to the Nazi past anywhere. That would never be allowed. That doesn't happen. Everything is scrubbed away because they understood that it is so corrosive to the national psyche to have even one thing that glorifies the Nazi past, that it's gone. And instead, all of the monuments in Berlin, for example, are to the Jewish communities that were murdered by the Nazis. So that's how they deal with the history. And as I said, in Italy, they don't do it that way. They leave Mussolini's monuments everywhere. And so in a way, when you say having history, maybe the question of history would be to really turn it on its head, like they did in Germany, get rid of the sculptures or knock them down or whatever, and contextualize around them, make those sites for how many people were lynched in this city. Instead, you know, Richmond, Virginia. How many people were lynched in Richmond, Virginia, like they have to the Jews in Germany? How many Jews were deported from this block? You know, this was the family, this was the bakery of the thus and such family that were taken to Auschwitz. I mean, that's powerful. And I think that that would be very interesting, I'm just suddenly having a public art idea, but again, not a public artist, of perhaps maybe taking fragments of those sculptures, cutting those sculptures up, taking fragments and really using them as to state those things, because we know that throughout this country, but especially in the South, there were so many acts of violence. And by the way, here's a plug for the book Cast. If people haven't read it, if you really want to feel and understand the magnitude of this, that Isabel Wilkerson's book Cast is really worth reading, because you start to see how much violence was done after slavery. After slavery, in the period when those sculptures were installed, how much violence was done against African Americans. And maybe that would be the way to contextualize the history, to show that the way the Germans have done.
That's a great suggestion. I highly recommend that book. She did a terrific job. It's very, very readable also. She's a Pulitzer Prize winner and writes for a general audience. So I think one thing I want to go back to is the public art process. And I have to give a shout out to my aunt Joyce Schwartz, who's on this, and gave me a start in my art career. And she was a pioneer in the area of public art. But what I saw working for her is how vexed the process of public art is. It is never an easy, how can you possibly, when you think about it, you have, say, a committee. The committee itself is hardly going to come to consensus. And then you're going to plop this thing in the middle of the, some public place, right? Same with a piece of architecture, and just say, now you're going to like this. This is really important for you to like, or to commemorate, or to honor, or to maybe to hate and throw eggs at. But one way or the other, there's no easy way to think about public art and to actually commission it and have a smooth process. Or am I mistaken, Rosa? Have you ever sort of witnessed this and thought, there's something that could be improved in this process? What do you think?
Well, obviously I come with my own point of view.
And then not to mention the materials that that people don't think about, like what's not going to survive a Florida summer, for example.
Right. More what is going to survive the Florida summer.
Right.
But here's the thing. The public art process, the commissioning process, I've seen every manifestation of it. Obviously, when it's municipal, where it's government and 1% or several percent laws are funding the work, there is a lot of agency among many different types of stakeholders. I think one of the, to me, the ones that are successful are the ones that include the material question from the very beginning, where and the ones that I find are always the best are the ones where you have a public art manager or consultant, that the minute the artists are selected, because I'm not really ever involved in the selection process of the artist. What I'm there to do is sort of look at the materials and the citing and make some recommendations, or at least let people know what they're signing up for. So when that process happens early in the game, and when it happens with the agency and the conservator and the artist all in the same room at the same time, you have the best result. Because what often happens now, people have gotten the idea, oh yeah, we got to involve a conservator in the public art process. So what they do is they say to the artist, go get yourself a conservator. And what the artist typically does is they wait till the last minute, then call a conservator and say, I need a response right away. This is due next week. And I don't do those. I will say to the artist, I'm sorry, I cannot do this for you in a week, and I'm not rubber stamping it. So the best ones are when at the very beginning, the artists are talking with the conservators, but also where the agency is there, because we're trying to protect the agency and protect the artists from their work looking terrible over time, because they don't want that to happen. You know, I know there are some pieces in certain South Florida cities, which I won't name, where certain artists are very upset about the way they are being allowed to deteriorate. And part of it is because nobody made those, you know, those discussions were not smooth in the way that they needed to be done. And then what happens is people who are funding these things are like, wait a minute, why is our city putting this money into this only so that it looks like this piece of junk? So I'm sorry, I'm going on and on.
No, it's really interesting, and actually it can bring us now the Q&A, because there are a lot of questions piling up, and one of them is, what do you do as a conservator when a municipality goes to you for a treatment on one of those monuments? Do you ever refuse a job?
Okay, hi Ruth, first of all.
That comes from Ruth.
Yeah, well, first of all, nobody lately has been asking any conservators to treat Confederate monuments. If I were asked to go and remove the graffiti on a Confederate monument, I'd say, nah, not me. That's not me. But I actually think you'd be hard pressed to find a conservator to do that now. However, I will say this, in the summer of 2020, we were hired by a city, a prominent Southern California city, that when at the beginning, at the first wave of protests following George Floyd's killing, a prominent Southern California wealthy city, wouldn't be too hard to figure out which one, called us to come out and remove graffiti from sculptures. Now, we went out. This is a collection we take care of. These are contemporary works of art. These are not Confederate monuments. This is like, you know, Tony Smith's and Yayoi Kusama's. Random stuff. So again, there's gradations. So if a Tony Smith sculpture was tagged with Black Lives Matter, would I want to remove Black Lives Matter? That would be a tough one. It would be really hard to remove Black Lives Matter from something. But if it were a Confederate sculpture, completely, of course, out of the question. So those are the gradations on that. And I hope that answers the question. But I don't think anybody much these days is, now what I would do as a conservator, because one of the things I think is highly irresponsible is for people to be tearing down these monuments on their own. That is dangerous. That is dangerous. You can't have, like, you know, just a group of people tearing like a 4-ton bronze off of its plinth. Someone's going to get hurt, and people were hurt. So I would, as a conservator, participate in this with a city or with a group of people in the safe removal of a Confederate piece.
Good to know. George Fishman. George Fishman has put out a question, and if they want a wonderful provocative conversation, which it is, why do you consider the early example of carved tags on the Pompeian Virgin mural as part of the historic record rather than a scourge?
First of all, that mural from Pompeii, that mural is from Subiaco, 20 miles north of Rome, where the Monastery of St. Benedict is located. First, that is a great question. First of all, it's because it isn't a single act. It is a series of layers of intervention that are a historical record. You know, they are from the 17th century. There's 1690 on them. These are historical acts that that the monastery chose not to remove for all those many centuries. So for suddenly a conservator to come in and say, time to remove it, makes no sense. And you get so much information about the fact that pilgrims to this site found it a question of either devotion or just statement to put their name and their date of arrival on this mural. So that's why I think, in part, it's the age, in part, it's the it's the continuity of activity that was part of it. I hope that answers.
But then couldn't you say that, ask this, I mean, say the same then for contemporary tagging? Like it shouldn't be removed because it's, especially, you know, the tagging that's politically generated.
Yes, you could, absolutely. But again, we're not talking about 20 years. We're talking about centuries. We're talking about tags that begin, scratchings that begin in like 1680 and go through, you know, 1850. So you have centuries of the activity. But again, I'm not trying to hide behind just the time frame. Yes, like 5 Points, you know, that whole, that building in New York that had been a graffiti site for all those many years. I think, yeah, that should have been maybe left. But okay, the Marine Stadium is a great example. The Marine Stadium's graffiti began in 1997. It continued through 2017 when the city locked it down and, you know, really made a huge effort to keep people out. I was always of the feeling that the graffiti should be left in place. The architect himself was of the feeling that at least portions of it should be left in place. Why do I feel it's okay to remove it now? For two reasons. One, because the artists themselves went into charrette with the artist and everybody came together to a consensus. The artist saying, look, if you take care of the building, we'll leave it alone. But if you don't, it's fair game. And also because the actual structural integrity of the building depends upon making repairs that are needed, you know, to remove that graffiti. And the other difference is the graffiti, the spray paint graffiti, unlike scratched in graffiti, produces a layer that is impermeable on a finish, and with concrete that has a breathability built into it, it does create problems, especially in a tropical humid environment like South Florida.
Interesting. You know, I always thought, I think I was going into Rio or I can't remember, Sao Paulo. There were these massive, massive murals, and they were in what I would consider very ugly, sort of vast tracts of highway, and I found them incredibly beautiful. It was sort of
Rio or Sao Paulo, because they're in Sao Paulo also.
Yeah, I think it was Rio because it would have been my first introduction to Brazil, and I remember thinking, you know, these they actually, to me, they benefit. I mean, just a personal point of view.
They do. I mean, Rome. My husband. It's funny when we were living in Rome. And you know, Rome, if anyone's been to Rome lately, Rome is covered in graffiti. And my husband said, if Rome weren't covered in graffiti, it would look like a Hollywood set because it's just so beautiful, Rome, that like almost the graffiti lends a bit of reality to the place. But
yeah, it feels human. It feels like that's that power of expression. I live here, you know, and it's you know, I think we're never going to be post graffiti. We're never going to agree on what's beautiful, what's destructive. I mean, yes, there are these, you know, the Wynwood walls and there are museums with graffiti, but, you know, I think it's always the idea that you would be able to like be the authority and change a public space on your own. And I guess maybe that goes back to what I'm saying is that we go through these fancy commission processes, you know, and then we end up with works that we may or may not like as a community. And sometimes, I mean, now here, I'm going back to somebody's question here, how to responsibly update, this is Maria Elena Gonzalez, how to responsibly update the public discourse of which sculptures to keep, replace, or toss. Oh, and then Ruth also asks about the proof of history, you know. And,
should I look at these? Because I can't, wait.
Well, yeah, they're in the Q&A. I mean, they're sort of very open-ended questions that you can answer any which way you want, Rosa.
Well, to answer Maria Elena, that is done at a municipal level. The dialogues that I've been seeing, there's many very brilliant African-American scholars that are addressing this question about what to do about the discourse of what sculptures to keep, replace, or toss. And the general consensus is that this is addressed locally, you know, and but, oh yeah, That's very, someone just writes here, the raising the flag at Iwo Jima might be offensive to people of Japanese heritage. Are they monuments that should be defaced by people? Listen, I don't know if they should or shouldn't be defaced, you know, and again, I have my personal feelings. My personal feelings are only my personal feelings. I know a lot of people feel really that Thomas Jefferson doesn't belong on a pedestal because of his keeping of slaves. And again, these are questions that we need to grapple with together as a society. I think the conversation is the interesting part, really, at this moment.
And it's happening all over. I mean, I was just thinking of UVA. I mean, I have no idea what the the conversations are going on among administration about what to do with the grounds that were so hallowed, by Jefferson. And I think a lot of universities, of course, are changing names and reconsidering the monuments on their grounds too. And of course, these are places of academic discourse and freedom. But it seems to me that the consensus from administration, for a lot of reasons, is to address the past by removing the names, by removing the statuary, and.
Hey, sorry to interrupt, but there's a couple of really cool questions here. One from John Stewart. Hi, John.
Yeah, John. Hey, John.
Where he says that ancient Greek and Roman temples were scratched by Northern Europeans during their 17th and 19th century grand tours. This was a rite of passage by Europeans supporting colonialism. Is this type of graffiti worth removing, even though it is itself historic? How do we weigh these decisions? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how you weigh these decisions, but definitely the decisions need to be weighed. I also think if they're scratched, it's almost, you can't remove a scratched graffiti. You can only cover it over or sand the monument, and that I would be totally against, because then you're damaging it. So a scratched graffiti is a harder thing to remove on a non-painted surface, because you got no choice but to either infill, and on a Roman temple it will look terrible, or by sanding down the monuments, which is something that people do, and that's the worst thing you can do. The worst thing you can do is to sand the stone down.
Oh, so Lauren adds, yes, I saw Lord Byron scratch his name in Paestum, Italy, by the way, or Paestum. You know what, I'm wondering, and I'm going to wrap this up because I know we're running out of time here. We haven't talked about the digital age. We live in the digital age.
Sure.
If you've given any thought to monuments, digital monuments, how, there's something you can fix right away if there's a problem, right? There's you sort of, I'm just curious. This has just occurred to me, this brilliant idea of how we might use digital art to make our monuments, and then in due course we can give them consideration or reconsideration. What do you think?
You mean like do something that's digital rather than
like a hologram?
Sure. Although those of us who love materiality, maybe, probably people who are in their 20s would say, hey, great, whatever, because, for me, I like materiality, but again, it seems weird to cast a 20-ton sculpture of something. Did anybody see that fantastic monument by, oh God, why am I blank? I'm having one of those moments where I can't remember. Carol Walker in the
Sugar Baby.
Yeah, that was, you see, that's incredible. The idea of doing something like that.
In a hangar. It was in the Domino Sugar Factory.
But it was also at the Tate Modern also, didn't it go to?
I think so. Yeah.
See, I think those are really provocative, interesting responses to things like this, like Joydi Minaya's work too.
Well, listen, I think we're coming to the
this is fun, guys. This is a fun group of questions.
Yeah, let's see here. How can we there are also projections on monuments, says
Yeah.
Regina. That's interesting as well. And then also, you know, I was going to say, as an historian, right, you know, when you take a work out of commission, I had brought up with you Laura Gilpin Frazier's Lee Jackson Monument in Baltimore. That becomes problematic for those of us who are trying to study the corpus, right, the body of work, and everything, you know, it's photographed or,
Right.
but so there are obviously there are no answers, but this is not meant to provide answers so much as ask a lot of questions and move the needle. Sorry, that's my dog, you know, answering. And move the needle in terms of how we think about public art, monuments, and maybe even our egos as human beings.
Right. By the way, one person asked about the graffiti on trains. It was Lauren, I think. And the thing about graffiti on trains is uniquely magnificent, because one of the great things about graffiti and street art is before it became a kind of codified Wynwood Walls type of thing, it had a lot of working fast was part of it. That's one of the things that these artists do that is so magnificent. They work fast. When they worked on trains, and the work, you know, the energy of that was visible in the works. So it's a completely different thing. I mean, you know, my personal thing is, when you see a lot of street art as murals, like what you see in Wynwood, literally it makes my eyes cross, because then you don't really, it's something else. It becomes something completely different, as opposed to a spontaneous expression. That doesn't make it bad. It just happens to not be my taste. But the point is, when you see it as a real authentic expression on a train, on a truck, on the street, in a building, on the roof of the Miami Marine Stadium, then you know you're looking at something that is cutting edge. And but not everything has to be the same thing either, you know.
I agree. And Rosa, we have to wrap up now. I've been told I'm getting the hook, but I would say, I want to tell you, thank you so much for caring for our art at the Frost, on the campus of Florida International University. I started a task force because, you know, we have a lot of cultivation and you know, we have to feed our children. I call them our children. We have to make sure that they are well kept. And, you know, we love public art because it is some way to encourage students and people walking around just to look at art. And of course, during the pandemic, it's been nice to know that art is available even outside the walls of the gallery. And you have helped us in so many different ways in terms of growing that collection and preserving it for our students and the public. So
An honor and a pleasure.
yeah, so it's just great to work with you. And I'm very enthused by all the enthusiastic responses, the number of participants for a Wednesday night, not bad. So thanks again, Rosa. I will see you IRL.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. Great
Okay.
seeing everybody. Anyone wants to email me, please email me. Thanks. Bye.
Signing off.
Arrivederci.
Arrivederci. A domani. Okay.
All right.